So thanks very much, Artem, and thanks everyone for being here. Of the two people here, I guess alphabetically, it's a little deceptive as to order. This is Alex over here, and I'm Stephen, and we're very happy that we have a crowd of people out here today, a lot of people I know, some people who I don't know, and we think it's a very important anniversary. We think it's a very important event and a topic, and in addition to walking you through some of the issues related to the global nuclear order and Russia's aggression against Ukraine and what its implications are, one other thing we'd like to do today, of course, is we'd like to have a kind of a structured discussion at the end where you can ask us questions and we can tell you what you think. And as Artem and some others know from having been in classes with us before, one of the things about discussing nuclear politics, of course, is you get a whole room full of people and you find very limited agreement among them. So I don't know if we'll agree on everything, but I think it's very useful to talk through some of the issues. So if you think about the world we have now as far as nuclear weapons, there are, as far as we know from open sources, because of course nuclear arsenals are classified as far as mostly numbers, types of missile delivery systems, etc., there are approximately 12,500 nuclear weapons in today's world, right? Spread out among 9 states. And Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, as you can see up there, but the 3 NATO nuclear states, the United States, the UK, and France, when you combine their nuclear arsenals, have functional parity with Russia. But when it really comes down to it, of these 12,500 nuclear weapons in the world, essentially more than 90% of them are in the hands.
Probably people on Zoom cannot hear you.
Then we will crank it up. Can you hear me over there on Zoom?
Yes, now they can hear you.
All right, I'm so sorry. And so I was just covering, as you can see here, that 9 states in the world maintain approximately 12,500 nuclear weapons, according to open source intelligence. And Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. But one of the points to be made here as well is that between them, Russia and the United States have approximately 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And that matters too when we think about the concept of nuclear arms control, because a lot of states, right, have been resistant to get involved in nuclear arms control if they don't feel like there's progress between the United States and Russia. Will this turn? It shall. All right. So one thing to think about here, if you've had classes, you write, or you've read in newspapers, you know about the concept of nuclear deterrence, right? And the concept of nuclear deterrence being, sadly enough, that countries have decided that by pointing nuclear weapons at each other's large cities, right, this means they will deter the other ones from attacking them, and we create these sorts of, right, mutually assured destruction relationships. And the interesting thing here is that when we think about the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they have what we call, right, yields of 14 and 22 kilotons of TNT equivalent when there's an explosion. And a standard nuclear warhead today from Russia, from the United States, from China, is actually generally orders of magnitude more powerful and more destructive than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. Of course, there's a plethora of different types of nuclear weapons, small tactical nuclear weapons that we'll talk about intended for battlefield use, larger weapons intended for targeting cities. But the reality of the situation is that of the 12,500 nuclear weapons in the world, the vast majority of them are actually more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right, these are gravity bombs that fall to the ground. Since then, of course, we've had a lot of development. We have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And we get to these points in these deterrence relationships that now with all of these ballistic missiles around the world, there are thousands of cities which are half an hour or less away from destruction at all times. And cities in Europe, given Russian weapons, are oftentimes, we're talking less than 20 minutes away from destruction. So it's really scary, and sometimes people like to do something where they set a timer and they say, when this thing goes off, the missile could have landed. We're not going to do any of that today. But this is the situation that you get in. And Alex and I have, during Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the nuclear threats by Putin, often been asked about missile defense. Like, can't we shoot these things down out of the air? And the reality is that missile defense is not very effective. There's very limited numbers of missile defense interceptors. They've never been tested under realistic conditions. So the only thing today that actually protects countries, right, from these missiles which can land in cities is deterrence, and the threat that if one country, if Russia were to attack another country that has nuclear weapons or its ally, right, there would be a nuclear response. And that's, for a lot of people, very unsettling to think about. Now, fast forward here to the war in Ukraine. And one thing that I want to point out is from the very start of this war, nuclear weapons were present and they were part of the conflict, right? I'm sure you've seen it. And that's February 24th, 2022, when Putin announces the full-scale reinvasion of Ukraine, makes the comment that whoever tries to impede us, let alone create threats to our country and its people, must know that the Russian response will be immediate and lead to the consequences you have never seen in history, which was largely interpreted to be a nuclear threat against potential intervention by NATO states who may consider intervening on NATO's behalf. And then, following the annexation by Russia of Donetsk and Lugansk, Putin made a claim and essentially said that, if our territorial integrity of Russia is threatened, we would be willing to use nuclear weapons, which was also interpreted to mean that perhaps Russia was now considering these parts of Ukraine, the oblast, which had been annexed, part of that, and would be willing to use nuclear weapons. And researchers in Berlin at the German Institute for Security Policy have actually tracked essentially nuclear threats and posturing by people in Russia, both Putin and officials who serve under Putin, and they've identified more than 200 different behaviors, whether threatening the use of nuclear weapons, claiming movements of nuclear weapons, making warnings about nuclear weapons. So this is a large intensity of nuclear threats or nuclear movements, and it's all encapsulated as part of this war where, right, nuclear weapons have been part of it from the start. Now, this has led to a lot of focus in the media to talking about this so-called global nuclear order, and have Russian nuclear threats in the context of the war in Ukraine caused massive damage or destroyed this global nuclear order, which is going to be the substance of what we talk about today. And these are not all showing up, which makes me a little bit worrisome about maybe some future slides here, but we're just going to roll with it. I think it's fine. But the general consensus that you saw almost immediately from a lot of scholars, analysts, policymakers is that Putin's threats in the context of the war in Ukraine meant a brave new nuclear world, and that you can no longer rely on the same nuclear deterrence and the same nuclear safety. Now, these are the questions that we want to ask today that we're going to walk you through. First, has Russia's war permanently damaged this global nuclear order? Are we in a new environment where everything is different moving forward? And to the point as well, can this global nuclear order survive repeatedly being hit with a sledgehammer during the war? And I mean the constant threats by Putin, which are seen to be in contravention of international norms, right? Invading Ukraine, a sovereign country, right, that had participated in the Budapest Memorandum and had given up its nuclear inheritance from the Soviet Union in exchange for security assurances from 3 states, as Artem talked about, including Russia. This is a significant violation of international norms to use nuclear weapons as a shield, right, to carry out a conventional invasion. If you're interested in some of the arguments that we're advancing today, Alex and I wrote an article very early on, actually in the summer of 2022, called The War in Ukraine and Global Nuclear Order, looking at some of these things. It's gotten a lot of reads, and people are interested in it, and we outlined that. And we think that the arguments that we advance in here, things, of course, are obviously very dynamic in this conflict. We change. They change a lot. We've updated some of them for this presentation itself, but we think a lot of that stands, and we think it's also a pretty good, easily accessible descriptor, right, to read about what's happening. It's the type of article that, you know, I send to my parents and my friends who don't work on these types of things, but I think it's also rigorous too and draws on different scholarly contributions to make its point. Now, when you think about what is this global nuclear order, our argument here is, if you're familiar, right, with liberalism in the international order, neoliberal institutionalism, is we think about this as a regime complex, right? The idea of the global nuclear order is to prevent nuclear weapons from being used. That's the point. And so our argument is we think of it as a series of international organizations, treaties, and practices to address dilemmas of the nuclear age. And so we break it down into a few different things. The first is, as Artem mentioned earlier, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968. This is the bedrock of the non-proliferation regime. It's a near universal treaty. North Korea has withdrawn. India, Pakistan, Israel have never been members, and South Sudan has yet to join since becoming independent, but it is universal besides that. And what the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does, right, is it says that countries that didn't have nuclear weapons at that point cannot get them, and it limits the countries that can have nuclear weapons to the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council: the United States, China, Soviet Union, now Russia. It's debatable. There was some talk about whether Ukraine could be an inheritor state from the Soviet Union, France, and the United Kingdom. But it also says that the countries that have nuclear weapons have to eventually move toward nuclear disarmament. And so obviously one could think, when we're talking about a state that had nuclear inheritance, right, and gave up its nuclear inheritance, then being invaded by a state which is allowed to have nuclear weapons in this treaty, using the nuclear weapons as a shield, obviously very relevant here. Additionally, arms control treaties, which Alex will talk about later, between states designed to limit numbers of nuclear weapons, types of nuclear weapons, missile delivery systems, other components. Extended deterrence guarantees, right? When the United States or Russia points its weapons, right, at other countries and says, if you attack me, I will attack you, that's deterrence. Extended deterrence is this so-called nuclear umbrella, right? The extension of nuclear deterrence guarantees to other states, which the United States has to defend NATO allied states, Australia, Japan, South Korea. These are part of it. And Ukraine, unfortunately, right, did not have a U.S. extended deterrence guarantee, so these sorts of things did not click in. Then legal governance of civilian atomic energy, right? These technologies are dual use. The same technologies you can use for nuclear energy will help you get to eventually a bomb if done in the wrong way, if not governed effectively, and regional nuclear agreements. What's not known by a lot of people is that the vast majority of the world has actually decided that they don't want to have nuclear weapons. There are nuclear weapons-free zones in Latin America and the Caribbean by treaty, in Africa, in the South Pacific, and in Central Asia, entire regions that have forsworn nuclear weapons, forsworn movement of nuclear weapons through there. And so the question that we're asking today is, this global nuclear order, all of these different components, which is designed to eventually stop the use of nuclear weapons, how have these constant Russian nuclear threats and provocations and the invasion of Ukraine using nuclear weapons as a shield challenged these institutions? And we're going to break it down today into 3 key areas that we think are good for categorizing this. The first is the erosion of the so-called nuclear taboo. Nuclear weapons, of course, have not been used since 1945, and there's a belief that there is a normative taboo on the use of nuclear weapons given the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's believed that this is why they're not used. This is how deterrence relationships exist, because people are aware of the consequences of using nuclear weapons. Has Putin's behavior changed this taboo, made it more acceptable to use nuclear weapons or not? Next is nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation. That's the NPT treaty I talked about. Has Putin's behavior made it more likely that some countries will pursue nuclear weapons? Has it made it more difficult to stop the spread of nuclear weapons? And thirdly, nuclear arms control. What has Putin's behavior and Russia's behavior during this conflict done to the prospect of having agreements between countries to reduce numbers, types of nuclear weapons, both quantitatively and qualitatively? Now let's start with the nuclear taboo. And what's really interesting is if you look at this chart here, this is Google Trends related to nuclear weapons in English, and you can look at it in other languages too, and it's fairly consistent. And what you see is you see a massive spike, unsurprisingly, in 2022, right around February. And the types of levels that we see is we're talking 8, 10, 12 times more as far as the interest in searching for nuclear weapons. And that went down a little bit, but it's now gone up. And what I can safely tell you, having monitored the Google Trends myself, is the searches for nuclear weapons today are now about 3 to 4 times higher on average than they were in years like 2019 and 2020. So publics around the world, in English and in other languages, are Googling things related to nuclear risk. They are increasingly concerned. And, we've done a lot of interviews where we constantly get asked questions in Switzerland about what would happen if Putin used tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine, what would happen if Russian behavior at the Zaporizhia nuclear power station, were to cause a nuclear accident. And so we get questions about the shelters and protection levels in Switzerland. So there's obviously an increased level of nuclear salience, I would say very much in Europe, but also around the world in many different countries. So the question here is, though, does that mean that it's more acceptable to use nuclear weapons, or does it just mean that we're talking about these things more now? And public opinion has been really fascinating for polls that exist. And I've heard, some discussion of polls in Ukraine, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of those in the future about questions about whether Ukrainians think that Ukraine should have kept its nuclear arms. I haven't seen a lot of those polls. I'm sure people in this room know a lot better than I do. But what we know, for example, is right now that 75% of people in a country like Japan, which was the victim of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, want to join this UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a new treaty which came out just a few years ago, primarily with support from countries in the global south, and it is designed to ban the bomb and make it illegal. So it's very different than the NPT, which allows 5 countries to have nuclear weapons. It literally bans the bomb everywhere, all nuclear weapons-related activities. And in Japan, 75% of the Japanese say they want to join. And that number has been steadily going up as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. However, of course, the Japanese government is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, does not want to join. 65% of Americans, ironically enough, also say they would be interested in joining this treaty, the TPNW, which is a fascinating thing given the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, the idea of the United States getting rid of nuclear weapons. However, that's one side of the coin. What we do know is when you interject, and I've done this in my own research, psychologically, when you give people information about the US government says they can't eliminate nuclear weapons when Russia and China have nuclear weapons, people's opinion drops. It's far below a majority because people in principle think it's a good thing to get rid of nuclear weapons, but if you start telling them about, for example, the size of the Russian nuclear arsenal and behavior, countries like the United States, their publics are not willing to unilaterally get rid of nuclear weapons. We also know right now 71% of South Koreans might support an indigenous deterrent. And South Korean President Yoon said, as a result of Putin's behavior, that maybe South Korea in the future, to deal with North Korea, would need to develop nuclear weapons so they didn't suffer the same fate in South Korea as they had in Ukraine. And 52% of Germans, for the first time ever, now want to keep low levels of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, which have been deployed there for decades, on their territory as a sign of the American commitment to Germany. This is unprecedented. Every time these polls have happened for decades, there's never been any evidence that a majority or plurality of Germans want that. So what you can see is that public opinion on nuclear weapons in light of this conflict is actually going both ways. It's still indeterminate. Some people, are more interested in nuclear abolition and getting rid of nuclear weapons because Putin's behavior makes them think about the consequences of using nuclear weapons and nuclear destruction. Others believe that if someone's threatening you with nuclear weapons, you should probably have your own nuclear weapons or be protected by an ally that has nuclear weapons. Now, This is Trump, obviously, on Twitter. And I want to make the point is that Putin's nuclear threats, while very scary, are not the first time nuclear threats have ever been made. Trump made nuclear threats against North Korea on Twitter, and researchers at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. have cataloged 80 to 100 nuclear threats made by leaders. So the thing that I think is really important to remember is, as much as we may be scared by threats that Putin is making against NATO member states and to use nuclear weapons, is that this is part of how nuclear deterrence works. And the countries that have these 12,500 nuclear weapons or are allied with the countries that have these nuclear weapons for protection are willfully engaging in nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is premised on the idea that by pointing missiles at each other, it makes us more safe because we have mutual assured destruction and we're less likely to use it. Whether you believe that or not, maybe you think it's destabilizing, that is the mantra of mutually assured destruction. And the thing is that really, after the end of the Cold War, there was a huge decline in nuclear salience. People thought, right, the bipolar rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union is gone, and we're not going to use nuclear weapons. And the public stopped focusing on this. So publics haven't been thinking about nuclear weapons as much as they're thinking about nuclear weapons today because of Putin's behavior. And, you know, in the United States, we used to have all these types of ads during the Cold War to tell people how to deal with nuclear weapons, and publics were more clear about nuclear weapons. And it was not until the 1980s in the United States, right, that duck and cover drills and being under desk went away. And obviously, you know, hiding under a desk, putting a bag over your head, these sorts of things, these things are not going to save you if a nuclear detonation happens. What these things exist to do is to acclimate publics to the nuclear age and to nuclear deterrence, and to convince people that a nuclear war is winnable. So I would say, before I turn it over to Alex in a second, as far as the nuclear taboo, I think what Putin is doing is super scary. I think using nuclear weapons as a shield and in an invasion is very dangerous. It's unprecedented in some ways, but I also want to make the point clear that nuclear threats by political leaders on television, on the internet, these things have been made for a number of decades, and these are, sadly enough, the things that the nuclear age that we have now is entirely premised on. Whether public opinion will become more supportive of having nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons, or getting rid of nuclear weapons still remains unclear. We just don't know it, and the polls go in both directions. But Alex is going to tell you a little bit more about what this may mean for countries actually developing nuclear weapons and for arms control.
All right, good evening. Thank you, Stephen, for doing the first part of this lecture. I would like to take over here right at the cue of Bert the Turtle. So that was a little mascot name, was Bert from the Cold War. So Stephen kind of set up. There does seem to be something a little bit different about the nature of the threats that have been emanating from the Russian Federation in the course of the full-scale invasion. It has, it's not unusual for a nuclear-armed country to invade another country. The United States has done this many times, but usually the United States will not use nuclear threats to back that up, right? Instead, what has happened here is that these nuclear threats have actually helped deter the support that Ukraine has received from its Western partners, right? Especially by raising the specter of nuclear weapons in countries like Germany in particular, that have a special kind of worry about all nuclear issues, both energy and weapons. They are convincing those NATO countries that if they give long-range strike capabilities to the Ukrainians that could reach into Russian territory, that this might be crossing a red line beyond which the Russians would have to respond with nuclear weapons. So just to re-emphasize what Stephen said here, nuclear weapons are being actively used even if we're not seeing detonations as part of this war of aggression. I've, of course, also seen, as Artem mentioned, the movement of tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus, and a lot of the missiles and the bombers from which munitions are being dropped onto Ukraine. They're, of course, not presently nuclear armed, but a lot of them are actually nuclear capable. So coupling that with the nuclear threat adds another dimension of seriousness to what we're seeing here. And then, of course, there's this entire Russian propaganda apparatus that is geared towards making the West afraid, making Ukrainians afraid of the Russian nuclear potential. If you look at some of the videos that they've created on Russian TV, they have these fantastical animations that kind of shows, okay, this is what it looks like to hit Berlin. This is what it looks like to hit the UK. In one of these animations, actually, it sinks the UK and also washes away Ireland, which I'm not sure what they did to deserve that, and which is obviously not how these things work. But there you go. It's just about creating this idea. And I'm sure it also has internal purposes of saying, oh, we're so strong. And something that received a lot of attention early on and has completely dropped off the radar, unfortunately, in the West in particular, are the absolute horrors of what is happening at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in and of itself. I mean, first of all, the treatment of the staff and the operators there is absolutely horrific. There are very credible reports of torture there. And that has consequences for the operating safety of the facilities. It really is somewhat close to a miracle that a more serious incident than a lot of the smaller malfunctions that have happened so far has not occurred yet. And this is, of course, also being coupled with systematic attacks on the Ukrainian nuclear energy grid, which by itself can destabilize the safe functioning of all Ukrainian nuclear power plants. So this is something we should really be paying a lot more attention to. And so just like in the bifurcation in the public opinion response that Stephen mentioned, states have also taken a rather bifurcated view of what this means for their own security policies. And usually that just means confirming what they already believed at the outset. Right? You didn't have a lot of countries that were convinced of the merits of nuclear deterrence, all of a sudden seeing the horrors of the war and saying, oh yes, we should now give up our nuclear arsenal. Rather, countries with nuclear options are more happy to have those. And so you'll see a lot of writing that says, yes, this only shows, this war shows that we need more nuclear deterrence. As we've harped upon many times, this was a war of aggression from a nuclear weapon state against a state that had given up its nuclear option, at least, and which was promised security assurances in exchange for dismantling that Soviet nuclear inheritance. So it doesn't really get more blatant than that, right? You can kind of jump up and down at the unfairness, the absurdity of this. And countries that have the option and previously were very anti-nuclear, thought that they would be safe by being neutral. If they're close to Russia, as in the case of Finland and Sweden, they're now running into NATO and into the safety of the broader alliance system, of course, which consists of many parts, not just nuclear weapons. But of course, they're very interested in being covered by that American extended nuclear deterrent. Other neutral countries, Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, despite the Russian TV animations, they don't seem to be all that concerned. In my view, that's largely because they're surrounded by NATO and protected by NATO, so they don't have to make any kinds of decisions like that. And so broadly in the world, also keeping in mind previous American wars of choice, if you're a country without nuclear weapons, you can say, look what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, look at what happened in Muammar Gaddafi. Both countries that gave up nuclear weapons programs, even though they were very early stage, they were attacked by the United States, had their regime overthrown, and their countries tossed into turmoil. And now we're seeing Ukraine suffering enormously, immensely. So is it the case that sovereignty in this world today can only be assured by the possession of nuclear weapons or through an alliance with another country that provides you with that assurance? International agreements, the UN system, all of that seems to be no longer functioning. So that would suggest that we would be seeing more nuclear weapons in the world. Others have gone a different way. They've said, look, the existence of NATO nuclear weapons has not stopped the Russians from invading Ukraine, a partner of NATO countries, a partner of the United States. We see the risks of how quickly even a conventional conflict could theoretically escalate up to the nuclear level. So why don't we all act together and make sure that that risk is eliminated by agreeing to get rid of all nuclear weapons together? So this is kind of a tension that is now emerging in this global nuclear order, which has always had to accommodate both a drive for deterrence as well as a drive for disarmament. Right, as Stephen had mentioned, even the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which as the title suggests is all about other countries not getting nuclear weapons, even in that, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, who also happen to be the nuclear weapon states recognized by that treaty, agreed in kind of vague language that eventually maybe they would talk about reducing their nuclear weapons. And they actually did quite a bit of work in that direction up until quite recently. And so, in particular, this kind of frustration with lack of disarmament, as we have on the slide here, is helping fuel this movement for global nuclear disarmament, saying that we need to establish a separate treaty, a separate structure that will force the nuclear weapon states to give up their weapons. And so some worry that this itself will destabilize the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty itself, that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty is seen as outmoded, as being unfair to the nuclear have-nots, and so now is it that this new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, will that attract more members who might leave the NPT and then join this other treaty? And here's kind of where Stephen and I are in one corner of a scholarly and also policy debate. We think the NPT itself is so much more durable than it's being given credit for these days, despite the obvious discontent. And that is because it delivers fundamental nuclear energy benefits to all of its members. It delivers security benefits to all of its members, right? If you are a member of this treaty, it's not only that you are being surveilled to make sure that your nuclear program is not being used for weapons purposes, but so is your regional rival. Right? And there's a monitoring system in place that makes sure that no one is building nuclear weapons in secret. And that generally is a quite stabilizing force in the world, and one that we don't think that countries will willy-nilly walk away from just because they're not seeing the same kind of progress on nuclear disarmament that they had been seeing recently. And it hurts a little bit to admit this, but most of the nuclear weapon states that are recognized under the treaty have done bad things to hurt the treaty ever since its inception. The French and the Chinese didn't join until the 90s. They would go around export restrictions and help build up the nuclear weapons programs of other countries. So most prominently, the French helped kickstart the Israeli nuclear program, also helped out quite a bit with the Pakistani program, and the Pakistanis themselves received a lot of assistance from the Chinese. The United States, obviously, we've talked about this, has abused its nuclear weapon status previously, and now, as well as before, we see the Russians doing the same. So on the non-proliferation side, we're generally much more sanguine. We think that the treaty will hold You might see one or two countries out there trying to build up a nuclear weapons capability, but even that is pretty unlikely. The real problem is in the domain of arms control, which traditionally has been a series of agreements between Washington and Moscow. And the unraveling of the arms control regime, the series of treaties that was built up during the Cold War and into the 1990s, has been unraveling for a long time. A lot of people place the origin of this unraveling to the US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. Then there was a bit of a lull, but more recently we've seen the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty fall apart. We've seen withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty by the United States and the Russian Federation. And sort of most worryingly, the most recent bilateral strategic nuclear weapons arms control agreement between the United States and the Russians, the New START agreement. The Russians first suspended on-site inspections, which wasn't that big of a deal because a lot of the monitoring can be done from satellites, from space. And then they completely suspended their participation in the other provisions of the treaty, while still agreeing to keep their weapons at current limits. And most of that is still kind of visible to the American intelligence community to make sure that they're actually doing what they're saying. But the problem is this treaty expires very soon, and there are no negotiations underway for extending this. So if that happens, there will be not a single agreement limiting nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, and no agreement that would verify each other's nuclear activities, which contributes quite a bit to nuclear stability, especially in a crisis time like the one that we're in at the moment. And also more recently, the Russians have been de-ratified their participation in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and have kind of been monkeying around a little bit with their nuclear testing site. Doesn't look like they plan to test anytime soon, but it is somewhat worrisome here, of course. And here is a list of some of the obstacles that explain why, in addition to the war, it's unlikely that there will be any kind of arms control agreement between Washington and Moscow anytime soon. Both sides want fundamentally different things out of the agreement. And one of the most complicating factors here is that in the United States, there's a substantial portion of the United States Senate, which has to sign off on arms control agreements. On the Republican side, they refuse to entertain any kind of treaty that does not also cover the Chinese arsenal. So, despite that pessimistic narrative that I just gave you, there are a few kind of general reasons for having a little bit more hope that, at least on the arms control side, an eventual kind of process between the two states could reemerge. One is that traditionally, some of the greatest nuclear crises have produced nuclear agreements. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself produced a test ban treaty. The destabilizing Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia gave way to the first SALT agreement, and the 1983 Able Archer nuclear scare, which is maybe a little bit less well known, but was a very dangerous moment in the Cold War. There's an active scholarly debate about whether it was more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, or maybe just a little bit less dangerous. But nonetheless, it wasn't a good moment. Led to a general rapprochement between the United States and the Soviet Union, producing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. That, of course, hasn't been with us for a while there. And also a little bit more cynically, in the long run, an arms control agreement with the United States is one of the most obvious pathways back for international respectability for the Russian Federation after the war ends, whatever that means, and whenever that is, because that's just not something that Washington would turn down. They're the ones who are asking the Russians, can we just meet and think about caps on our nuclear arsenals, especially in this dangerous time. Okay, so taking this all kind of together, our kind of net assessment here is that ultimately the global nuclear order has always been flawed. It has always been under threat. It has always been destabilized by the actions of some states. but it's actually held up pretty well. And for the most part, the existence of the global nuclear order in its current form serves the security and economic interests of most countries. Right? So we think because it serves in the interests of most countries, it has a much better chance of surviving. It will, of course, matter how this war ends, whether the lessons more globally really lean towards disarmament or everyone saying, okay, we need our own nuclear weapons to preserve our security. And it's actually quite helpful, I think, for, especially in Europe, there to be an open debate, finally, about the role that nuclear weapons play in our insecurity and what roles they might play in our security or not. For too long, this topic has been hidden away from publics, intentionally so, by the political and policy elites of these states. They've been afraid of public opinion, but we don't think that is something that can really persist for too long, and it really shouldn't. So let's talk about these things more openly. And finally, I want to close the presentation by talking more directly about what these things mean for Ukraine. And here, really all we can do is parrot the absolutely phenomenal book that was written by an outstanding Ukrainian historian at Harvard University, Mariana Bujarin, who wrote the definitive account of why Ukraine gave up its Soviet nuclear inheritance. And she comes to the conclusion, which seems quite right and still holds today, that giving up the arsenal was the right choice. It was a difficult choice, but it was the best thing that Ukraine could do at the time, in no small part because of the existence of the global nuclear order that forced countries into being either a non-nuclear weapon state or a pariah state of the global nuclear order. And being a pariah state is not the path that an independent democratic Ukraine wanted for itself, and I don't think that it wants for its future now. Instead, it could invest more in its conventional capabilities, and especially the tremendous missile knowledge and missile manufacturing capability that Ukraine had at the point of independence can be revitalized. It is a bit of a missed opportunity that throughout the 90s and early 2000s that the Ukrainian state did not invest in keeping that capability alive. But here we are, and it can still be recreated under great difficulty. But kind of a clear message that I think relates to the discussion of the global nuclear order is that it's impossible for Ukraine to live in a security vacuum. That on the one hand, you have the Russian Federation, and then a big gap, and then you have NATO as protected by extended deterrence from the United States. And obviously, NATO membership would be the clearest way towards receiving that kind of protection, but it's also possible to build on some of the promises, the broken promises that were in the Budapest Memorandum. And quite frankly, that is something that Ukraine could have worked more in the 90s and 2000s to say, we have this agreement, what does it mean? Let's keep talking to the British and the Americans in particular about what their plans are to backstop the promises that were made here. But it's still a useful document, but documents are what you make of them in the international diplomatic process. You can't just get the signature and then put it on the shelf and say, okay, we are now protected because we have these guarantees. And finally, it is important to say, as kind of nuclear historians and scholars, nuclear armed states have lost many, many wars. The Soviet Union and the United States managed to lose their wars in Afghanistan, and there's plenty of other examples. And it's certainly my hope that this particular nuclear armed state that we've been talking about loses this war quite soon. So that's all for us at the moment. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex and Stephen. I will be taking some questions now, and maybe Oleg has also some questions on Zoom. So if he raises his hand, then we'll have some questions on Zoom. Is there anyone who has a question for the speakers? Yes.
As a Ukrainian, first of all, I'm interested if Russia will start using nuclear weapon, either it's tactical or other kind of. Is there going to be any response from the NATO states? Who will be the first military base who will respond? In the response, some weapon would be in Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom. How long it will take, if it will happen or not? And can you also give a bit more overview on the decision-making process about this response in the NATO states, and also about the public opinion in the NATO states about this nuclear response? Will the population support this or not?
I'm not sure if Alex and I will agree on everything here, which is fine. I would say this much, one of the questions that we've gotten a lot from the media over the past more than year and a half now is, can you give us statistical odds on what is the likelihood that Russia will use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? And I have asked groups of scholars and other experts to, in a large room, give me a percentage. And you have people who say everything from less than 1% to people who say upwards of 20%, which is just an enormous, enormous difference. And I would say even the 1% is an unacceptable risk when we're talking about the potential use of nuclear weapons. I think there are some questions about whether or not it would be useful or beneficial for Russia to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine at this point. I don't think that it would help Russia take territory. I don't think that the young men who were drafted in Russia have the training and many of them personal protective equipment to walk through areas where nuclear weapons have been used. And it's not clear to me exactly what Russia would gain from using nuclear weapons. I think that one of the things that has kept Russia afloat, despite its transgressions and its behavior, is the support of China, the either support or ambivalence of India, and support or ambivalence from the global south. And I think we forget when we look at UN resolutions about condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, people frequently point that it's the vast majority of the world states have condemned Russia in the UN General Assembly. But the reality is actually, because of China and India, states that oppose that resolution or abstained represent 52% of the global population, did not actually condemn. I think that Russia has a lot to worry about as far as India and China and support from the global south that doesn't support nuclear weapons use. And my understanding is that both the Chinese and Indian leaders have been very clear with Putin that if you use nuclear weapons, you will lose our support. And so I think that matters. My response is always, I won't put a percentage on nuclear weapons use. Whether or not it will happen, I think it's unacceptably high. I think the risk is elevated, but I don't think that when I think about all the horrors that have gone on the ground in Ukraine and continue to, that nuclear weapons use is the thing that keeps me up at night. And maybe Alex has something to say about what might a potential NATO response look like and what's been discussed.
Sure, yeah. And I think on this point, we broadly agree. Although, of course, in the end, no one here knows whether the Russians will use nuclear weapons. I'm not sure even Putin can really tell for sure yet. But especially in this phase of the war, it seems quite unlikely for the bad reason that the Russians are sitting pretty comfortable and are feeling pretty good about themselves, especially going into the next year. So that is sort of the unhappy inverse of what we see on the battlefield at the moment. In terms of a Western response, I very much doubt that certainly a Biden president would respond to Russian nuclear use by asking NATO to participate in a joint strike against the Russians or a unilateral American strike. Something that is much more likely is to, say the nuclear weapon came from a ship at sea. It could well be that the United States Navy would decide to sink that ship as a way of signaling, don't do this again. There will be a response, but it won't match the nuclear escalation, because that's exactly what the United States in particular wants to avoid, is a general nuclear exchange between the two. But on top of that, there have been very active intelligence channels between the United States and Russia to manage some of the possible escalation points in this war. And as I understand it, it has been communicated quite clearly, not only to the top Russian leadership, but most people involved in the chain of command there, that they will be held personally and professionally responsible if they participate in the use of a nuclear weapon. And so the question is, if you are Russian and in this system, do you really want to spend the rest of your life hiding in a bunker, hoping to avoid retaliation from the Americans against you personally, rather than there being a general nuclear attack on some Russian assets?
I would just add to that on the question about public opinion. There are public opinion studies, there are a lot of them, that show that a lot of Americans would not support a nuclear attack if one of the U.S. allies under the nuclear umbrella, like Japan or South Korea, was attacked. There is good evidence that the U.S. public is supportive of conventional responses, but I think Alex is right. I think that any response, I think there would be a response. I think it would be conventional. We can only speculate. U.S. military analysts who are retired generals have said that maybe the United States would sink the Russian Black Sea Fleet or something like that, but we simply don't know. What I would say is I very, very, very strongly doubt that a U.S. response would be nuclear.
All right, anyone else? Yes, sir.
My question would be about the nukes that have been moved to Belarus. Where I'm from in Italy, we actually have a nuclear base not too far, and the US has them in Turkey as well. How big of a move do you think that is from Russia?
Well, the U.S. also has them in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, as well as Turkey and Italy, and it's this NATO nuclear sharing of tactical nuclear weapons to be used on the battlefield. There's been a lot of controversy about this, but the thing is when you trace back the lineage, my understanding is there were already steps underway between Russia and Belarus to have a legal process for placing Russian tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. I think that the war in Ukraine probably escalated that by placing them, right, and probably sped up the process for deploying the Iskander missiles in Belarus. But at the same time, I would say that the things that could be done with those Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus are things that Russia could already do with nuclear weapons based in Russia, which are not too far away from Ukraine. And I would say that I personally, I don't know what Alex thinks, we're about to find out, think that it is more posturing and about signaling Putin's hand and trying to signal strength than it is about actually using those nuclear weapons. Still, I think that the addition of nuclear weapons to Belarus, which has been a staging ground at times for this invasion, is not a good thing, and the placement of nuclear weapons closer to a conflict zone is never a good thing.
Agreed entirely. I would suspect that there are motivations other than strategic military use. It has a lot to do with the relationship between Russia and Belarus, I would think, and the idea of putting Russian nuclear weapons on the ground in Belarus will always give the Russians a reason to prop up the regime in Belarus. And the other benefit is, of course, just to keep reminding the West that we Russians were doing things with nuclear weapons, and that should scare you. So please stop supporting the Ukrainians.
Hi, Alex and Stefan. I have just a query, not a question, but I'm just if we try to link the kinetics with the dynamics, apart from this nuclear war of situations or the escalations, which are the countries which get benefited with this kind of scenarios and war kind of situations, so that we can, or apart from economies, how we can link this war kind of situations in different geolocations which get benefited, and which are loser and which are winner when such kind of situations arises. How you at the end, the normal people and the common public try to understand why this kind of situations is arising at different locations and who is ultimately get benefited with this. Is there a link between the economies and the war, the producers of this, the immunizations and all this?
I think it's a really good question. Since we're talking about this war in particular, it's kind of unclear to me who it is supposed to benefit. All right. Obviously, it's meant to benefit the historical imagination of one man in particular. But it's it's certainly not benefiting the Russian people or the Russian state overall. So it's hard to kind of see a link between, say, the Russian defense industry and the war itself, because the Russian defense industry was very happy not having to fight wars in the lead up to this full-scale invasion, because that just means you can skim off more money from contracts and live good lives in villas in Italy or say somewhere closer to here. Whereas now that kind of lifestyle has been seriously disrupted. On the nuclear side, I think there's a similar story, kind of more broadly in the world, which is the nice thing about nuclear weapons in the minds of those who really like them, is you get to build all these things, you get to build big bombers, you get to build big missiles, but you never actually have to use them. And yet you can still kind of keep getting paid for that. So yes, it's a really good business to be in. It's a nice racket, but I don't see that translating necessarily into then countries wanting to go to war in order to use the weapons themselves. So I hope I understood your question or the spirit of the question roughly correctly. And if not, I'll hand it over to Stephen.
So I think Alex got the spirit of the question more correctly than me, giving you a less kind of meta example. I would say that one of the biggest beneficiaries of this war, even though it's not intended, I would say is China. I would say also North Korea as well too. And there is a reason why certain countries who have always said they're against foreign wars and foreign invasions and have always voted a certain way in the United Nations General Assembly or had certain positions at the Security Council are changing their tune and are either supportive of the war in the context of the United Nations or are supplying the Russian military with munitions. I would say that for China, there is a massive benefit right now to keeping the Russian isolation going. Russia has become increasingly more economically dependent on China and is getting also a lot of weapons as well. And I also think that there are countries in the world, particularly China, who are very closely watching and studying the technique of using nuclear weapons as a shield to invade a sovereign state when thinking about a potential template for an invasion of Taiwan or something in the future. That's not to say that China had anything to do with provoking this war or causing it, but when we think about who benefits as far as who can provide a political and economic lifeline, I think there are a number of countries that are doing this. And there's no surprise that Iran and North Korea, for example, are supplying, artillery shells and drones, et cetera, to Russia too.
Thank you very much for your talk. And thank you very much, Stephen, for having mentioned the word spiritual, or the spirit of the question. I mean, this is something we never heard by Swiss academics. So it's important to keep that in mind. So I would like to express that the basic mantra is that he who attacks first dies second. I guess both parties know that and know the risk for that. And the other thing is that what I think that 40 years ago, in the early 80s, the danger was much bigger, because they had no real tactical. They had tactical nuclear bombs, but now, due to the progress, the technological progress, I mean, you can handle that much smarter. You know, at the time, the soldiers been in Siberia, and once they had the order to attack, so they ran out of the field and opened the stuff, and then the attack began. So you would never have been able, as a high officer, to cut this let's say the green light. That is one thing. The other thing is how should I say? Give me the keyword.
Well, we can take your first question.
Yeah, okay.
And then can go back to you. So you're so the question of who has the command authority and who is able to actually use nuclear weapons. It is true that since the Cold War days, and the picture was a bit different for the United States and for the Soviet Union, that at this point the launch authority is sort of securely centralized. And in fact, the Russians have a very large tactical nuclear weapons arsenal still, but these are still in central storage facilities. So they are not being forward deployed onto ships, onto submarines, onto air bases where they could actually be delivered. And the release from those central storage facilities is being monitored very closely, of course, by Western intelligence, and it would take a huge political decision to actually give them for potential release. And even there are still procedures in place for verifying that a nuclear command that comes in is indeed the wish of the president. But of course, we have the kind of terrifying understanding that ultimately it is only up to the president of the United States and the president of Russia to decide whether to use nuclear weapons or not. There have been a lot of films made over the years that kind of suggest, you have to have a second person signing off on this order or something, and that is absolutely not the case. The only kind of verification process that happens is to make sure that this is indeed the American president expressing his or her will to use nuclear weapons. And it's a little more complicated on the Russian side, but ultimately it is the Russian president's decision.
Yeah, okay. And second point was, it has been told to us that the American high officer went to their peers of generals and the Secret Service and explained them very clearly, if you attacked us, you will have to count with this reaction, that reaction, and another reaction. Of course, we do not know what kind this is, but they are very aware what kind to expect, what to expect when and how the US will retaliate. And I personally, well, it depends maybe if the US is attacked or just a tactical bomb on Ukraine. Maybe the response will be quite different. But I don't think that at the time, if the Russians attack by a nuke, that there is no time left to discuss. So all this decision might have been already taken in the case of. And then it depends on the function, what kind of attack the Russians do present. Well,
okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. I think you're right. I think we would see a dramatically different response for a Russian nuclear attack on the United States versus a Russian nuclear attack on Ukraine. I think it's pretty unquestionable. And I think a Russian nuclear attack on the United States would certainly get a nuclear response. And I think the United States has been very clear about articulating consequences for many decades now to the Soviet Union Union and then Russia about what would happen were you to use nuclear weapons. And what Alex is saying too is it's become increasingly clear that there are channels between the United States and Russia warning Russian officials about things that would personally happen to them again in the future. And I think what's really interesting about this is, if Russia were going to use nuclear weapons, Alex is right? It depends on how Putin is feeling, and it depends on one man. But I think if there were more serious consideration of using nuclear weapons in Russia, I think you would start to see signs or signals that it was going to happen. The first being, because it's heavily monitored by Western intelligence agencies, is I think there would be some awareness that Russian tactical nuclear weapons had left the central storage facilities. The next is, throughout this war so far, we've seen a number of people, even high up in Putin's inner circle, have leaks on Telegram channels when they disagreed with things in the war. And I think that were there to be a really serious consideration of using nuclear weapons, I think you are likely to see actually essentially dissent channel on Telegram from people who disapprove of nuclear weapons use. And what's really interesting to me, because I do a lot of track 1.5 and track 2 dialogue where we have, either Russian officials in an independent capacity or Russian independent experts come together and talk with people from different countries, is the Russian experts I'm talking to have been telling me for quite a while that Putin has not made a single nuclear threat during the context of the war in Ukraine. I personally disagree. I don't think that's true, but their interpretation of what would be a nuclear threat as far as what Putin would say Russia is willing to do and what Putin would say the consequences are and what Putin would say he wanted to happen or not happen would be clearer. And so I think that you may see intensified, clearer rhetoric as well, too. Alex?
Well, that's good.
All right. If you, one more question. Okay. Oh, the last question, okay? It's time to go eat. I'm hungry.
I just wanted to ask about kind of notoriously Elon Musk blocked Starlink access, just because they sent a drone that was trying to blow up a ship. Do you think that's realistic? Like, what would be the dynamics that could lead to an actual nuclear escalation from that?
Well, I think the esteemed owner of X and the genius behind the Cybertruck perhaps understands less about the dynamics of war than other engineering challenges, because we've seen quite a few Russian ships sink. We've seen some strikes pretty deep into Russian territory that have not produced that kind of escalatory response, and the Ukrainian government itself and the American government as well has a much better understanding of where the various gradations of red lines and pinkish lines might be. So I think in this case he was needlessly cautious, to put it that way.
I would just add that one of the things that we have seen, as Alex pointed out throughout this war, is that while there are channels of communication and conversation between governments about nuclear signals and other things, there are also narratives that happen to publics to convince publics that certain war efforts are justified or are not justified, and particularly from the Russian Federation to reach out to Western publics to scare them and to try and change public opinion and to try to get them to stop funding and stop supporting Ukraine. And so I think that, what has been very interesting among many things about this war has been all of the disinformation that abounds. There's multiple conflicting narratives, and I think that, Alex is right, and I would assume that people in the intelligence community, people sitting at the Pentagon and otherwise, have a much clearer understanding of escalation pathways and ways that conflict will unfold than Elon Musk.
All right, I'll just break my own rule for a little bit and ask a question myself, just as a closing remark. In the spirit of this conversation, this presentation, I'm talking about.
But you said you were hungry.
Yeah, I changed my mind. Going back to the nuclear global order, if Russia were to lose tomorrow, the whole war. Do you think is it possible to return back to the sort of security architecture we had before 2022? Or has Russia fundamentally altered the way we think about nuclear weapons or the way we think about the global dynamics of nuclear weapons? What is your opinion on that?
One of the comments that Alex made earlier is that a lot of the future of the global nuclear order depends on how this conflict ends, in what sense. I think that if Russia, despite all of the problems with its military that are well documented, is able to leverage its nuclear weapons as a shield and do the opposite of what you said and win the war, that sends a strong message about the utility of having nuclear weapons, both for countries that have nuclear weapons to use them as a shield and for countries who would be scared about suffering the same fate as Ukraine. What I would say, on the other hand, if Russia were to lose tomorrow, despite having the world's largest nuclear arsenal, despite all of Putin's nuclear threats, my belief, and I could be wrong here, is that would substantially devalue nuclear weapons and show them to be less useful than they actually are in conflict.
Yeah, I think Russia has done more to change the way we think about Russia than it has to change how we think about the global nuclear order and the security architecture. And even Russia losing obviously means that from a European security order perspective, things will have to change. And things have changed. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now, that was Alex and Stephen. Please give them a big round of applause. And I will be inviting you to join us for the apéro on the foyer on G floor, which I think is just outside the room, right? Outside and upstairs, yeah, on G floor. If anything, I'll be beside the door and I'll lead you. All right. Thank you. Thank you.